Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the Art with World. Today we have a very distinguished guest with us, Miss Ilona Yusuf, who is an English language poet, editor, essayist, and critic. Welcome, Ilona, in our program.
Thank you.
We'll discuss with you various things about Pakistan, Pakistani poets writing in English in general, what are the publishing issues, what are other issues for those poets who write in English in Pakistan. But first, we would like to discuss with you how it started with you, how you started writing poetry, what interested you to write poetry in general and particularly in English in Pakistan.
So, I'm of mixed heritage. I'm half Pakistani, half Polish, and my early childhood was spent in England. So my parents focused on English as my first language. I feel a little sorry about that because I think if I'd learned both Polish and Urdu early on, it would have been a lot better. Urdu to mujhe aati hai, but Polish is a bit of a lost language for me. I started writing very early, probably when I was about 7. Not poetry. Poetry came when I was about 11, I think. And as I said, my early childhood was in England, and then we moved to Lahore in 1970, the end of 1970. So my schooling and my college years were spent in Lahore. And that was during the 70s. So the 70s, you know, like maybe if I start talking about what was happening in the poetic, let's say, world in the 70s, it'll give you a little idea of how vibrant that period was. In fact, Oxford University Press a few years ago came out with a book called The Radioactive Decade. And the radioactive decade was the 1970s because it was very vibrant in all spheres, whether it was theatre, literature, performing arts, design, just about every sphere. So if we look at poetry, then English poetry or writing in English had existed, you know, even pre-partition, and it continued as a movement. But I think it developed an individuality within the 1970s. There were poets who were writing in the major cities. So let's say in Lahore you had Tawfiq Rafat and you had Kaleem Umar. In Karachi, poets like Adrian Hussain, Maki Qureshi, Salman Tariq Qureshi. There are many more poets. In Lahore again, Waqas Khwaja. You know, there's a wide variety of poets who were writing and who were writing very seriously. Alamgir Hashmi. All of these in Lahore were, I think most of them studied at Government College. In Peshawar there was Dawood Kamal. So all of them became very notable poets within that time. And also, because I was growing up at that time, so even when I was in school, the British Council and local colleges used to organize poetry writing competitions, and Tawfiq Rafat and Kaleem Umar had quite a lot to do with those ventures. And one of these competitions was actually judged by an English poet, a well-known poet called Anthony Thwaite. So that was my introduction to actually putting my poetry out. And it was very good because, you know, when you write, you do want to be able to share your writing.
Right.
It's because later on, this is what I experienced, that it became a very personal thing because of circumstances.
Can you explain how it became a personal thing because of circumstances?
Well, partly because I think during the Zia era, these platforms for publishing decreased significantly. Or the idea of further promoting literature or literature in English was, you know, it became inactive. I know that Professor Alamgir Hashmi, who's also a very noted poet, he said that, for instance, newspaper was the place where you could express your views and there were articles on literature and so on, and I remember that too.
Okay.
It's not that things died out completely, but they became a lot. I think there was much less opportunity for writers at that time, or you had to be able to, you had to know where to look and where to go to be able to follow those things. But for me, it was not a period of activity. Partly because of this, and partly because I got married and I had young children, and I was not writing for a while, and I didn't have friends in the writing world, or even friends who wrote. So, you know, sometimes a community, well, I think oftentimes a community of writers or some kind of interaction with writers is very helpful, especially when you're younger.
You have a multicultural background. I mean, your mother was Polish, father was Pakistani, you were born in UK, then you grew up in Lahore as well, you studied in Lahore, then you moved to Islamabad. How did all these things contribute into your worldview and of course on your poetry as well?
So as I said, in the 70s, it was a very good period for me, and then in the 80s, as I said, I kind of didn't write much. Well, I think by about 86, 87, I was writing again. And for me, at that time, actually, I didn't live in Islamabad, I lived in Rawalpindi. But the great thing at that time was libraries still existed. Now we do have school and college libraries, but at that time you had the American Center and you had the British Council. These were in Islamabad, but I used to regularly drive to Islamabad, bring my children to the library, and that's where I discovered poets like Muniza Alvi, who's again of mixed heritage, but brought up, I think, mainly in England, and her work reflects that mixed heritage. And it was very interesting for me because, you know, I sometimes felt, okay, as somebody of mixed heritage who writes in English, what scope is there for somebody like me? But that gave me a lot of, you know, inspiration in a way.
Right. I was going through one of your articles in which you had, it was, I think, mapping Pakistani poetry in English, something like that. And you referred to a certain school of thought who emphasized on Pakistani idiom and Pakistani expression even in English poetry. Tawfiq Rafat was perhaps spearheading that. So what's your opinion?
So I think this is all part of the development of poetry from Pakistan in English. Initially, and there was a very defined reason for it, because what happened was that people who were studying English poetry were studying poets from the English canon.
Yeah.
So all the references, all the cultural references were from England, which, let's say, budding poets over here were just taking on and using without thinking that, okay, we have our own cultural references which we can incorporate into our work. So that was the idea, I think, behind Tawfiq Rafat's Pakistani idiom, because in his own work, you know, poetry is about the human condition, and it has to have a universal kind of appeal. So it can't be limited to a certain place. It has to appeal to anyone everywhere, the thought process behind it, or the concept behind it, or the metaphors. But at the same time, certain cultural references they do exist. And if you try and import them from somewhere else, especially you haven't lived in that place or haven't been in that place, then it comes across as very artificial. So that's the reason that Tawfiq Rafat, because he was a mentor for many, many poets, so he understood where this was coming from. So that's why he actively promoted the idea of a Pakistani idiom. Later on, that may have become a little limiting if people took it to extreme, let's say, using it in an extreme way or a limiting way. But that was, you know, your individual response to it. Lesser poets, let's say, might have, you know, made it more limiting. Later on, in Karachi, there was a group called Mixed Voices,
Mixed Voices, yeah.
which was started, I think, by Adrian Hussain, and then there was Maki Qureshi, and Salman Tariq Qureshi, Muin Farooqi, who is an artist as well as a poet.
Like you?
Yes, I think the visual element comes into a lot of writers' work, so, you know. And what they advocated was a universal voice. So that's, again, around the same time, but also developing from that. And I think each follows the other, or they overlap, you know. And so everything contributes to the development of, let's say, a local canon. Because honestly speaking, these are the poets who, let's say, in a way, I mean, if we have eventually proper documentation, which we are now, I mean, people like Muniza Shamsi have extensively documented.
Tariq Rehman is also.
Gee, that's right. Pakistani literature in English.
Yeah.
Then, you know, those names will be documented, and what they did in order to further a local canon, all those things will be a reference point for generations to come.
Don't you think that demanding from a poet that he or she should write in certain idiom is a little unfair, because a poet expresses his or her own experience the way it comes to them, but to instruct them, to demand them, I mean, sometimes your political people demand that they should write this thing, or sometimes even literary ideologues demand from them that they should write in this way. Don't you think it's kind of limiting poets' scope in expressing themselves?
I don't think people like Tawfiq Rafat intended it to be limiting.
Okay.
I think it was, for him, it was like a springboard for more freedom. You know, rather than using a particular, you know, let's say, references to English poetry, he said, look ahead and look out and, you know, use what you see around you. So, yes, like I said, if they were lesser poets, then they used it in a more limited manner or in a limiting manner. So, you know, that again depends on individual poets.
So what are the trends in Pakistani poetry in English? Are they using local references more, or are they more on universal voice? And also considering that in today's world, in contemporary worlds, nothing is so local. I mean, we know what's happening around, things happening around are affecting us all the time.
So I think that, you know, any kind of writing at any point in time, there has always been literary exchange or cultural exchange all over the world. Obviously, it would have been slower in past times, and much faster, like the speed of light now, because of the internet. So, I mean, for me, I think that the internet has been instrumental in giving new poets a much more wide scope and range of reading, you know, in translation, poets, all international poets, you know, accessing different genres of poetry. But within that, you'll see that, you know, for instance, if you look at America in the I think it was the 60s and the 70s, when the ghazal became something that American poets espoused, and it began to be taught.
Really?
Yes, in American universities. And now young poets, you'll find, have begun to write the ghazal in English. So there's, for instance, a very well-known poet, she's an excellent poet, Shadab Zist Hashmi. She writes ghazal in English, she writes qasida also. And she's actually written a book on the ghazal, and it's called Ghazal Cosmopolitan, and she says that it is something which becomes like a transcultural thing, and which actually is true because it's been used by Goethe and also by Lorca in the 20th century. So you can see that this literary exchange takes place. And now, so she's been writing ghazal for several years now, I think over a decade, but now you'll see young poets in Pakistan who are using the ghazal as a form, whether sometimes in the very traditional way, and sometimes as a take on the ghazal. So it's a very interesting kind of development.
Can you name a few poets who are writing ghazal in English?
So like I said, Shadab Zist Hashmi, then there's Waqas Naeem, he's a Rawalpindi paste poet, another one Hasib Sultan. Then in Karachi there's a young guy called Zain Baweja, and then I think Uruj Mirza in Karachi. You know, there are people all over who are experimenting.
Okay.
So this is traditional form but modern poetry.
Well, this is very interesting because even in Urdu poetry, some people say that the time of ghazal is up and they are more for poems, prose poems, and you were just told that poets writing in English, they are just taking up ghazal as their preferred choice. It's very interesting how things are just exchanging. What kind of subjects you more often take in your poetry?
Well, varies. I've written a lot of poetry on nature, but I've also written, I'm a very apolitical person, but I have written some poems which I think are political. Maybe other people don't consider them political, but for me they are.
Okay.
So, and obviously when you read a poem, then everybody reacts to it in a different way.
Okay. Maybe you are referring to your poems like From Sawat and 9/11 and Jalbi, maybe?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Would you read out some poem for our viewers?
Okay, so this one is Jalbi. And I usually divide my poems into 1 or 2 or 3 parts. So part 1. Oil fizzes at the edges of the glistening vat, crusted with blackened accumulations. The ustad drizzles his muslin full of orange batter, slick-skilled doodles burned into his head by years of practice. Boiling, they rise to the surface, a maze of elaborately linked spirals, lifted in one effortless movement and laid in a neighboring vat of fragrant viscous syrup, then piled into a complex of crisp, brittle, sugary lace curlicues with empty centers bordered by disconnected edges and abrupt dead ends. 2. This going around and around, drawing invisible webs, widening circles around the eye of truth, a once deliberate evasion of the clear and simple eye of clarity that's become reflex, like a dog coiled around himself in unremitting motion, spins to catch the tip of his tail and draws an avid crowd.
Very nice.
Thank you.
You just specifically mentioned that you are apolitical, and that's fine. Poets in vernacular generally, I mean, there are 2 kinds of school of thoughts. The poets who write in vernacular, most of them belong to certain kind of ideology, and that also perhaps help them to find people who appreciate their poetry. In my own opinion, one should not demand from a poet to follow a certain way, because as I already said, that would limit his or her perceptions and his or her own way of discovering the world and discovering himself. I mean, maybe you would like to add something to that?
Well, I mean, like, there's been in the past criticism that, Pakistani poets in English, they are not connected to what's going on in the country because, not just in Pakistan but elsewhere in the world also, bringing politics into your poetry has been very important, and it is important. But at the same time, if you look at Pakistani poetry in English, or Pakistani poets writing in English all over the world, most of them have a connection with Urdu poetry and with the vernacular. In many cases, they translate from Urdu into English, or they have written in both languages. And in many cases, they don't write just about apolitical things. Politics does come into their work. So if you look, for instance, at the work of Waqas Khwaja, he's written about Kashmir because he's Kashmiri, and he's written about displacement of Kashmiris. That's an anthology, collection of poems called No One Waits for the Train. And he's written now also poems about Palestine recently. So then if you look at the work of Maki Qureshi, she's our first female poet from Karachi. And she had written poems which are not, like for instance, if you look at my poem Jalebi, you might think it's about a jalebi, but it's not really about a jalebi. It's about truth, and it's about, in my case, it was about the media and how people spin lies together, and that makes people who watch be unable to see what is the truth. But she's written about the violence in Karachi in many different ways. So it's not that people weren't aware of what was going on. They were, and they wrote about it.
Okay, coming back to these publishing issues in Pakistan, even for the writers, not only poets, fiction writers who write in vernacular, they have problems. I mean, there are no financial rewards. There's no proper marketing.
There's no financial reward for writing in Pakistan. Sorry, but it's the truth.
It must be. How do you think it's for the poets who are writing in English? Is it the same case or it's different?
I think there's a lot more opportunity now, especially, so I consider, let's say myself as something of a lost generation because I'm very bad at marketing myself. And I shouldn't say even marketing, I should say connecting. Whereas younger poets, through social media platforms and also because they're younger and have more energy, there are more opportunities for submitting work to online journals or even print journals here. Here there are very few, and abroad. But in general, connecting themselves. With somebody like me, I no longer have the energy to constantly submit my poems to different places. But I think that social media has been pretty effective for younger people now. So let's say from the early 2000s, I would say that at least there's a little bit of opportunity for people writing, for young poets to submit their work. Desi Writers Lounge was one of the, actually Chalk.com probably was the very first online portal for people writing in English. And then there was Desi Writers Lounge, which helped people to edit their work and fine-hone it. And then finally they came out with print issues. Then after Desi Writers Lounge came the Missing Slate. And Missing Slate closed and then reopened. So it ran for several years, and then it was inactive for a while, and now it's active again. And all of these journals have started, they are putting together writing as well as art. So like, for instance, this one, the Aleph Review, this is a print journal, but we also have an online platform. And what comes online is different from what goes into the print issue.
And you print it annually?
It's an annual publication. So we have 7 issues to date, and we have almost compiled work for the 8th one.
And do you have some publishers internationally as well who take work from Pakistani poets writing in English?
Yes, so I mean, like I said, young people are more connected. I've submitted work to places like the Dhaka Review, which is Bangladesh, of course, and then the Little Magazine, which is based in India. Also a publication called Pics, which is again an Indian magazine, which is photography based, but they also publish writing. There are countless publications actually, so.
You have written about poets in diaspora as well. You have written about, you have referred to Zulfikar Ghosh and others, Aziz
Because I
Hashmi.
think that they had a connection, or they have a connection. In Zulfikar Ghosh's case, he passed away, but you know, he had a connection to his roots. It's very much reflected in his work.
So now, can I just ask you, what are your favorite poets? And
Oh, I don't have favorites. There are many poets who have inspired me. So, you know, if I'm talking about my youth, and I'm very bad at remembering off the bat now because I'm not so young. So, out of English poets, Gerard Manley Hopkins.
okay,
I used to read a lot of Dylan Thomas when I was very young. Shakespeare, of course. Then, you know, I read Fairs in English, but then I would read the Urdu for the music.
okay. In Faiz was translated by Dr. Mehboob.
No, V.S. Kiernan, I really like
Okay.
those translations, and then Naomi Lazard,
Okay.
Iftikhar Arif in translation, but there's a particular translation that I like, which is by Brenda Walker, who was also a poet.
Do you think it makes some difference if you are also familiar with local poetry traditions, like people who are writing in Urdu and subjects they are taking up in their poetry?
I think you need to read, I think you need to be conversant with your heritage, or with what comes before you. If you're going to write, you have to read very widely your own literature from your own country, as well as international literature. So both, you know. The more you read, the better.
Your first book was published much earlier, I think. Picture This
Yes,
was
that's
its
right.
name.
And it was so, as you know, like I said, I consider myself a bit of a lost generation, because when when I was writing in the 80s and the 90s, there were literally no platforms. And I stumbled on chalk.com, for instance, quite by chance, because I was like, well, when the internet came, then I loved the internet. And I thought it had a lot of, you know, potential. Actually, after chalk.com, there was also another one, Lahore Nama, which I think it was maybe founded by Raza Rumi, or Raza Rumi was one of the people who was
I don't remember actually.
was one of the founders. But anyway, that's besides the point. So I had been submitting my work, or trying to submit my work for publication, and it, you know, there were no venues really. I mean, Ferosans said, okay, self-publishing. You know, nobody was ready to accept work, and if you sent it abroad, then you were sure to get a rejection notice, which did happen with me. Then all of a sudden, this publishing house called Alhambra, it's Alhambra here in Pakistan, Alhambra in Belgium. So the publisher was called Shafiq Naz, and he started spending quite a lot of time in Pakistan, and he started promoting English writing by Pakistani writers. I was one of the people that he promoted. Another one was Hima Raza. Now Hima Raza, again, mixed heritage and very, very different writing. So, you know, from, you know, Pakistani idiom to universal voices and more contemporary poetry. Then Hima Raza was like postmodern, a very, very different voice. And then she experimented with different things, like with pictograms and, you know, different kinds of layouts of poems. And I would say like a very unique, very individual voice. And she died in her 20s, so, you know, yeah, her career didn't go further. But she was instrumental in, I think, further developing English poetry.
You have discussed publishing problems for the young writers in 70s, 80s, in the earlier phase. How about that now yourself are an associate editor of LF Review, which is quite prestigious English language journal, and you are providing space for your other new and other contemporary writers. What's this experience?
Oh, I think it's really enriching because, you know, the quality of the writing that is coming out is actually, I mean, for me, I think poetry is often much more accomplished and spontaneous than prose, very often. So we have excellent poetry coming out, and this is by younger writers.
Okay. You're also editing something for Valum Journal as well.
No, so Vellum was a one-off, and that was,
Okay.
it was called the Pakistan issue, and that was in 2011. And I'm currently finalizing, you know, editing an anthology of poetry written from the year 2000 onwards. And it is poets based in Pakistan as well as the diaspora. Very often the diaspora poets, either they have moved from Pakistan and had some education or all their education here and then moved abroad. In some cases they were born abroad, but they are very conversant with Urdu because their families made, somehow poetry ran in the family, you know, or you know, cultural interaction ran in the family.
You have just referred to this Vellum, which you had compiled Pakistani poetry in English. Was it well received?
Oh yes, so this project came about because there was an award-winning poet called Blaine Marchand. He's Canadian, and he was based here for a while. He was working here, and Valum asked him to put together an anthology of poetry, so he asked me to be his co-editor. So we worked together on the project, so I was not the only editor. And it was a wonderful experience working with him because, in fact, he's been a mentor to me also in my poetic career. And I think that is necessary if you find somebody who is sincere and who understands your voice. Then if you show them your work, they can point out where it would be better without losing the spontaneity of the work. So he's been like that for me.
I have just read somewhere that you are also working on your next collection of poetry. Where has it?
Well, I decided that, you know, like, publication is very difficult for poets. So, so recently I think I need to give a little background here. I did artists' book workshops a few years ago, several years ago, actually almost 10. And I thought that I would start, because publication is so rare for poets here, I thought that I would combine text and image and make artist books. So I did make 3 or 4, and then it was, you know, I didn't have time to do it. Various things, you know, intervened in life, and I was unable to. But recently, I collaborated with an artist, and she did the artwork, and I handwrote the poems. So we did 1 very limited edition, and then 3 unique books. So artist books can be done in different ways. You can do a unique book, which means only 1 copy. Then you can do an edition which can be anything from 5 to 200 copies. So we did an edition of 5.
Yeah.
But the idea is to do an edition of 100 or 200, which will be accessible to people who want to buy it. So that component we still have to work for. And the reason I wanted to do it was because there are so few avenues for publication. I felt this was a good way of, you know, writing the poems and maybe publishing them off the desktop, or printing them off the desktop and then making them into artist books with some artwork, which is, you know, let's say like an illustrative element, and then selling them as they are. So let's see where that goes. So I do have a collection. It's called Garden Sequence, and that was exhibited.
Would you like to share with us your art books?
Okay, so I will have to. So this is an artist book. So it's like you can. This one has a removable spine, and this one is handwritten. So you can just unfold it like this. You can read it page by page, but it's written on both sides, so you can turn it to the other side. You can also display it like this. This one's handwritten, but the idea is to make copies of it eventually.
Okay. Well, this is a very nice way to connect word and images.
It's very popular now in the West, so
Yeah.
and you know that the art of the book is not just confined to the West. I mean, like, it was very much in the subcontinent in the form of miniature albums.
Yeah, I've seen, I mean, Chughtai painting Ghalib's book, Diwane
That's right.
Ghalib.
Yeah,
And I think Sadken has also done
yeah.
something
These
like
kind of collaborations have been there, and then even centuries ago in the form of the artist albums, the miniature artists.
So I think now we have come to the point where I should request you to read out another poem of yours, if it's okay.
Okay, I will read the last one out of Garden Sequence.
Okay.
This is number 16.
Mhm.
Cool, moist stillness of fading monsoon, soft throat of night suffused with the ceaseless two-note treble of crickets, shadows cut across aloes and agaves, dividing deepened greens, plains of light and shade, to the spike-leaved bush bearing nondescript green-white flowers, candle-nubbed clusters that bloom to release giddying nocturnal breath, fragrance-infused night air, something pure, transparent, as if fistfuls of stars have come down past the diaphanous veils that frame the entrance to heaven.
So anything else you would like to share with us about contemporary poetry particular, because you are editing this LF review as well. Anything you would like to share with us?
Well,
What do you find most striking in contemporary poetry?
oh, total individuality. It's really exciting. I mean, there's all kinds of experiment and no fear to experiment, and a lot of spontaneity. It's really good. And also I find that the good poets are actually, they really do believe in reading. And reading is what will improve your work, because you're absorbing so much of good literature. It doesn't mean you're copying, but it gives you an anchor and a vision. So there's a lot of very good work coming out.
So you're quite hopeful about
I'm
poetry
not just
in English
hopeful,
in
I
Pakistan.
believe that it's very good.
And publishing issues have also been improved, right?
I think we need a lot more publishing houses, and I think we need publishing houses that also focus on poetry. There are publishing houses, it's not that there aren't, but a lot of the focus is on prose, and I think that poetry deserves a niche.
But maybe, I mean, you have raised another question as well. What's your observations of people writing in English but not poetry, fiction or other prose in Pakistan?
There's some very, very good prose.
Okay.
I think sometimes with prose, and this doesn't happen with everybody, with some writers it happens if they're taken up or encouraged to use certain themes. That's a bit of a downside, because then you lose your individuality. But I think that was more in the first, let's say, 15 years of the 21st century, and now I think people are much more individualistic now.
Okay.
I do feel that there are sometimes issues with editing and with, because I believe in, writing needs to be very tight. I can't quite describe tight. You can be descriptive, but you don't need to repeat things.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're editing, that's something you really need to focus on, and editing is the hardest thing to do. You have to approach it with a sense of humility and constantly looking for how you can make your writing better. And that's one thing that I feel that, people need to put more effort into.
Okay. So there are many other things to talk about, but I'm being told that the time is up for this program. So thank you very much for being with us. It was very interesting, very informative conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Arshad Saab, for putting this together because, you know, it's been really wonderful.
So viewer, thank you for watching us. See you next Sunday, same time.